This piece explores the poetry of Eavan Boland, a woman poet, and the significance of her work in Irish literary history in representing Irish identity. It will focus on the loss of Irish identity through the lens of the suffering of women and how Eavan Boland gives voice to Ireland, having the nation take the form of a woman within her poetry. They became their own muses, validating female experience as both starting point and the subject of their own literary work. I have represented 3 of Eavan Boland's poems on a piece of pottery using the ancient art of Ireland, Celtic knots. In the poem Quarantine, Boland references the potato famine. This was the same year that Vaudreuil Dublin pottery began mass-producing pottery with ancient Celtic designs upon it, so I felt that a piece of pottery was the perfect, historically significant medium for Eavan Boland's work. With many ties to England, he then sold his Celtic-designed pottery line all over Europe and the Americas as part of the Buy Irish campaign, while Catholics in Ireland were being buried in mass graves. The Celtic symbols I chose to represent the 3 poems each have a specific meaning that I feel reflects the work in a meaningful way. Vaudreuil even managed to commodify Irish suffering. Consumers could feel that by purchasing Vaudreuil Dublin pottery, they were contributing to the development of the Irish economy and were also advocating a newly emergent national style. The first point I would like to make in this presentation is that national identities are often feminized or referred to as women. This is because they are a place of belonging, of comfort, and the source that will produce future generations, for example, Mother Russia. This concept is amplified in countries that have been colonized. The use of female iconography to represent national identity in post-colonial territories arises as a result of the generalized feminization of nature. The Irish territory has been feminized both by England allegorical representations and by Irish myths of colonial resistance. England violently oppressed Ireland for centuries, intentionally causing a near-total loss of identity, culture, language, history, and a sense of value within themselves. If Ireland was a woman, then England could be seen as her rapist. Everything that has been done to a woman has been done to Irish. It has been marginalized, its status has been taken from it, it has been reduced to the language of small farmers and fishermen, and yet it has survived, and survived in extraordinary richness. To examine the loss of identity in Ireland parallels the loss of identity in women. Therefore, in Irish poetry, when reading about the plight of women, you are also reading about the plight of Ireland, a woman abused for generations. This female allegory works as a representation of grieving Ireland, anxious to be rescued from British oppression. The poem Atlantis' Lost Sonnet is a comparison of the loss of Ireland's national identity to the entire mythical city of Atlantis vanishing beneath the water. Lots of women's poetry has so much to reclaim, a whole Atlantis under the water to reclaim. It's like this island, again in Irish folklore, which surfaces from under the water every 7 years, and if somebody can go out to it and light a fire or do something, it will stay up forever. In the Atlantis Lost Sonnet, Boland writes, "In the best traditions of where we come from, they gave their sorrow a name and drowned it." She is referring to the deep sense of loss that they feel over their language and historical identity being erased. These isolated and perishing words of a dead language also arouse the sympathy of the poet. They are like the oppressed women. Historically, Celtic knots are a single unbroken line that reconnects with itself with no beginning or end. In my pottery piece, I chose to represent Eavan Boland's poem, Atlantis' Lost Sonnet, with a Celtic knot banded around the neck of the bottle. The line is broken to represent the break in the cultural identity of Ireland that is represented in her poem. How on earth did it happen, I used to wonder, that a whole city had all gone one fine day underwater. Amethyst beads. This poem is about a woman, Ireland, and how the beads she wears connect her to the deeper roots of the multiple generations of her ancestors that wore the beads, and even the lands that they came out of. Now I wear at my neck an old stress of crystal, an impression of earthly housekeeping, a mysterious brightness made underground where there is no sun. She attempts to build a bridge between the ancestral identity and the modern Ireland. The colonization of Ireland is redoubled by a colonization of women that is affected by the circulation of simplified images of femininity within nationalist discourses. Boland would refigure nationalism in the image of women, not as ornaments, but as a particularized individuals experiencing poignantly realized desires and struggles. The triskelion is the most ancient Celtic symbol. It has 3 swirls in a triangular shape. It represents birth, death, and rebirth. The symbol is both ancient and about generations, and the beads are shown in my rendition of the triskel. Quarantine. This poem is about a couple that suffered from famine-related disease. They must walk a long distance for help. At one point, the woman cannot walk on, so her husband carries her, and they both freeze to death waiting for help. The suffering during the famine dehumanized the Irish people. It stole their sense of identity, to the point that their Irishness became associated with poverty and ignorance. In Quarantine, Boland wrote, "In the morning they were both found dead, of cold, of hunger, of the toxins of a whole history." The Irish died in droves, even falling over in the street. This type of loss became normalized for them. Eavan Boland's poetry rails against this loss by focusing on the individual voice of Ireland, represented by women. In this act of pushing women to the forefront of literature in Ireland, specifically poetry, she is attempting to give them a voice. Gender relations are at the heart of cultural constructions of social identities and collectives. The question of adopting a subject position becomes further complicated if the female voice is located in a post-colonial territory, as is the case in Ireland. Women poets like Boland had to come to terms with their loss of personal identity. I was a half-named poet. My mind, my language, my love for freedom, these were named. My body, my instincts, these were named only as passive parts of the poem. 2 parts of the poem awaited me, 2 choices, power or powerlessness. The Celtic knot for lovers is 2 hearts interlocked. I chose this to represent the poem Quarantine because of the double meaning in their shared lives together and their shared deaths. In the end of the poem, her feet were held against his breastbone. The last heat of his flesh was his last gift to her. One of the hearts is inverted, just as the couple must have been when they died in order for her feet to be placed upon his chest. Let no love poem ever come to this threshold. The goal of modern Irish poets like Eavan Boland is to dislodge the objectified and silenced voice of Ireland and Irish women, and to insert a more realistic image of both women and the nation as survivors, who are creating a newer, modern identity for women and Ireland. The fusion of the nation and the feminine is which the poems of women and by women have disrupted, subverted. Irish women poets can therefore be seen as the scripted, subservient emblems of an old image file come to life. In a real sense, the Irish woman poet is now an actual trope who has walked in conveniently out of the text. When thinking of Irish identity in poetry and how it has changed through history, one must consider representations of women in Irish poetry as synonymous with Ireland. A vision of rapidly liberated Ireland has become the site of a fully independent and sovereign state with a unique and separate identity. This helps to put a voice to the painful past and the changing future Irish identities. The story will continue to change long after the poem is finished, and too will her place within it.
Created using Powtoon.